For most of its history, jazz has been shaped by the musicians themselves, on the bandstand, in recordings, and through the constant dialogue between tradition and innovation. The music has always evolved from within. But today, the forces shaping jazz are more complex than ever. Festivals influence what audiences hear. Institutions shape cultural narratives. Cities and corporations invest in the music for economic and social reasons. And at the same time, artists and independent labels are building their own paths outside traditional systems. So the question isn't just who's shaping jazz today. There's a second question that might be even more important. Who should be shaping jazz today? Should the direction of the music come from artistic leadership, from cultural institutions, from civic and corporate investment, from audiences, or from the musicians themselves? Today, we're looking at 3 stories that each explore that tension from a different angle. First, the appointment of drummer Nate Smith as the new artistic director of the Newport Jazz Festival, one of the most influential institutions in jazz history, and what his leadership might mean for the music's direction. Then, the announcement of a massive new 25-day festival in Los Angeles, backed by city leadership and corporate partners, raising questions about cultural storytelling, community engagement, and the role of civic power in shaping jazz. And finally, a look at the JazzWeek radio charts, which reveal how jazz actually operates on the ground today. A decentralized ecosystem where major institutions, independent labels, and self-released artists all exist side by side. Together, these stories offer a snapshot of where jazz is right now and invite us to think about who should guide where it goes next. My name's Chip Boaz, and this is This Week in Jazz. So last week, drummer Nate Smith was named as the new artistic director of the Newport Jazz Festival. This was some information that we had been waiting for since we heard about the former artistic director, the great bass player Christian McBride, stepping down after a decade leading the festival. Now, Smith's appointment is a 3-year commitment that begins with this year's festival, which runs July 31st through August 2nd. And what that means, what does an artistic director actually do? Well, so he is in charge of shaping the lineup philosophy, booking artists, setting the thematic direction of the festival, being the public face of the festival, influencing the cultural narrative of jazz programming, and helping guide education initiatives. Now, right off the bat, when you think about that, that is a lot of power, a lot of responsibility that can have a huge impact upon the direction that the festival and jazz itself goes from here on out. Now, Smith commented on this and he expressed humility about taking on this role. He recognized the great work that Christian McBride did over the course of his tenure as artistic director. And he gave interest in strengthening the artist-audience connection and a commitment to helping the music thrive. Now, these last 2 are where things get interesting. Artist-audience connection. That could mean a lot of different things, and it could prioritize one over the other. Is the artist sharing their work with the audience in a way that connects them? Or is the artist prioritizing what the audience wants? Those are two very different things that we'll talk about in a little bit that we want to keep thinking about. And then a commitment to helping the music thrive. What does that mean? Music and music business can thrive in lots of different ways. Does that mean bringing more people into the audience? Does that mean making more money? Does that mean artistic growth? These are all very different things that could happen through Smith's tenure at the Newport Festival. And we're going to have to wait and see. We're going to talk about all this, but this will be really interesting to see how this unfolds. Now, on the other side of the equation, the Newport Festivals Foundation said they wanted someone who could honor jazz tradition while pushing the music forward, connecting artists and audiences more deeply, and keeping the festival innovative and culturally relevant. Ooh, that's really interesting right there. Culturally relevant. That could mean a lot of different things. That could talk about artistic directions. That could talk about commenting on what's actually happening in our culture right now through the music. Those are big topics. In particular, Chairman Bruce Gordon specifically emphasized Smith's ability to stay rooted in jazz while keeping it fresh and forward-looking. All of these signals are really talking to me about big changes in the way that Newport might be seeing the music. Now, I could be reading into this. That is a definite right there. But it is making me wonder about what direction Newport will be going in the future. But to really understand that, let's stop for a minute and let's take a look at the history of the Newport Jazz Festival and at the history of Nate Smith and see where those things intersect. Now, Newport as a jazz festival has been a cultural institution in the jazz world, one that has had a huge impact on the music, on the musicians, on the way that the world perceives jazz. This has had decades of influence upon the music. And it has done some really specific things. I think in particular, Newport changed the way that we consume live jazz. Before the Newport Jazz Festival started, jazz was mainly happening in clubs, ballrooms, and dance halls. There weren't really large-scale concert presentations. Well, Newport introduced outdoor staging, large listening audiences, multi-day jazz programming, and jazz as serious art music. This is really the way that we think about the music today. Big outdoor summer festivals or fall festivals, whatever that is, goes hand in hand with jazz. That is just something we think about today. But that started with Newport and influenced a ton of different festivals. Everything from the Monterey Jazz Festival, the Montreux Jazz Festival, the North Sea Jazz Festival, the San Jose Jazz Festival, the San Francisco Jazz Festival. This is how we got to modern global festival culture. It shifted the music from dance halls and clubs towards listening-centered concert music. This is really important because through Newport, we started taking jazz more seriously. We started thinking of this as a music of less as something we go out and have a good time while it's playing and we kind of have the music in the background to something where we sit and focus on the music, which is really how we think about it today, how it became art music. Newport was a big step in that. And as part and parcel of all that, it has shaped the careers of jazz musicians, sometimes lifting them up and often writing jazz history in real time. There are lots of great examples of this, but probably the most historically important and example that we hear about a lot is when Duke Ellington played there in 1956. At this point, Ellington's career had slowed down a little bit, but at Newport 1956, Paul Gonzalez played a 27-chorus solo on Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue. The crowd went wild. They were dancing in the aisles, cheering, yelling, and right away, Ellington's career was revived. The recording of the festival performance became a massive commercial success, not to mention a historical recording that we refer to today. And it led to major new recording contracts and tours for Duke. This ensured that we knew about Duke Ellington's legacy today. Now, this is one of the clearest examples of that festival performance changing jazz history in real time. But Newport has done this again and again. It can literally reshape careers and rewrite the narrative of jazz history because people are watching what happens at Newport. And that's important. And that's a responsibility that Newport has taken seriously. And they, through doing that, have thought about jazz on a wider scale. And they've given it room to grow and evolve. So, as a result, Newport has given legitimacy and visibility to things like avant-garde jazz and modern jazz. Over the years, Newport has presented major innovators like John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman, Charles Mingus. The festival introduced new sounds to large audiences. This is no small deal. Most festivals that we talk about today are really into playing it safe. They have these big audiences come and they bring in the crowd pleasers. They bring in the people that they know audiences will have fun with, dance to maybe. They might even bring in artists who we could argue whether they are jazz adjacent or not. Newport did not do that. Newport documented Coltrane and his rapid evolution from a hard bop icon to his modal period in the early 60s. And in the 1965 concert that he played at Newport, it was straight up avant-garde. And the Newport Festival embraced it with open arms. There are recordings of that Newport Festival, and these recordings helped legitimize experimental jazz because it was presented in the mainstream. Newport has validated innovation, not just tradition. And that's important that we walk those two lines in the jazz world. If we fall too far into one or the other, we lose sight of what the music is all about. Newport's done a really good job at that, not only kind of offering the things that are outside of the traditional space, but also opened up to different genres. Newport has had swing orchestras, bebop artists, avant-garde players, fusion acts, cross-genre performers, contemporary artists. Who appears at Newport often signals what the establishment values, what directions jazz is taking, and what artistic what artists are canon worthy. That's really important. And all of these kind of cross pollinations that we see there are really important. I think of, in particular, a iconic picture of Miles Davis standing off to the side of the stage at Newport watching Sly and the Family Stone perform. Now, we could argue, well, Sly and the Family Stone, that's a funk band, that's not really jazz, maybe they were influenced here and there, but not really jazz. And I would agree, and I might argue that they don't belong on the stage. But what happened? Because Miles got to see them and probably got to hang out with them afterwards, pick their brains a little bit. We got things like Bitches Brew, In a Silent Way, and all of the great fusion that Miles did. Newport has been a melting pot. It's positioned jazz as part of a broader American cultural ecosystem. It didn't isolate the high art. It found ways to bring things together. Now, let's not forget, okay, we've been talking a lot about the artistic things that Newport has done and contributed to the music in that way. But this is a business, okay? Newport influences the greater jazz industry. When an artist performs at Newport, it could open up tours for them, different types of bookings, different possibilities to be featured on recordings. It adds a bit of prestige and recognition to that artist, and it tells the audience that this is someone who is worth listening to. So a booking at Newport is not just another gig. This can be a career milestone, and it impacts the broader jazz ecosystem. It's not just about that one gig, about that one day. It's about what the world is watching when an artist performs at Newport. So it's been really influential. That's a little bit about where Newport has been. Let's look at where it might be in the future by checking out a little bit about the career of their future artistic director, Nate Smith. Now, Nate Smith is probably considered one of the most influential contemporary jazz drummers, particularly for his pocket bass playing and modern rhythmic language. Boy, you listen to Nate play and he has such a groove. It would be a dream to play some grooves with him on bass at one day. He just has such an amazing feel, an amazing pocket. He started this at age 11, learned some piano, but it's important to note that his early influences were rock and funk. He was listening to people like The Police, Earth, Wind and Fire. Quincy Jones produced music. People like Michael Jackson. He became interested in jazz at about 16 after hearing Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. His father had a great record collection. He was able to hear all of these different things. Now, as a young drummer, Art Blakey, no better role model. But let's think about how that relates. Blakey was a fiery bebop player, but he also, think about tunes like Moanin' and things like that. He had a pocket that really relates to bands like Earth, Wind and Fire or funk bands. I could see how that really appealed to Smith early on. Now, he decided to pursue music and as a result went to university, went to James Madison University on a percussion scholarship, but then earned a degree in media arts and design, and later attended graduate school at Virginia Commonwealth University. Now, so he was not fully focused on music, and a lot of discussions about Nate Smith describe him as largely self-taught and evolved through mentorship that we'll talk about in a minute. But this is an important point because so much of the trajectory of young jazz musicians today is about going to school, going to college, getting the gig out of college. And I don't know how I feel about that, honestly. That's probably a discussion for another time. If you've got thoughts about that and how that affects the jazz world, put them down in the comments, because it feels, I don't know, it feels like it's pushing the music in a funny direction. But Nate Smith, if we talk about him as self-taught, that opens up the possibility of a little more innovation, that opens up the possibility of not being tied to the idea that jazz has to be a certain thing. That's important. But let's talk about mentors, because I think this played a big part in Nate Smith's evolution to where he is today as an artist, and will affect his decisions as an artistic director. Now, one year when he was performing at the International Association for Jazz Educators, he met jazz legend Betty Carter. And as a result, he joined her Jazz Ahead program and performed with this legendary artist at the Blue Note. This is really important because Betty Carter's program launched multiple major jazz careers, and Nate Smith is one of those. From there, he joined Dave Holland's quintet in 2003. He appears on some pretty important Holland recordings like Critical Mass and Pathways. This, to me, playing Dave Holland's group, legitimacy beyond legitimacy, because Dave Holland is not only deeply rooted in tradition, he was in that whole fusion explosion in Miles Davis's group. He is a top of the mark composer in jazz, doing everything from writing beautiful, touching pieces to really challenging intellectual music with different odd time signatures and modalities and all sorts of stuff. So to play with someone like Dave Holland, right away, I have a huge respect for Nate Smith. And those are some great albums too you should check out. And after his time with Holland, he became an in-demand drummer. He's worked with folks like Chris Potter, Jose James, Pat Metheny, Nora Jones, Brittany Howard, Ravi Coltrane, even Paul Simon. He's had a cross-genre reach that has touched straight-ahead jazz, but not been limited to it. He even co-wrote and produced a Michael Jackson song, Heaven Can Wait. That is pretty intense right there. He plays now in the funk supergroup The Fearless Flyers. He has been in and out of the jazz world, and it shaped who he became as a leader. Probably one of his most defining statements was the album Kinfolk, Postcards from Everywhere. This was about 2017. It's something that blends jazz, funk, R&B, and soul aesthetics. At this point, this was Nate Smith saying, jazz is cool, but let's bring in all of this other stuff too. And he just released last year an album called Live Action, which won a Grammy for Best Alternative Jazz Album. And it really solidified him as a drummer with strong pocket playing. He kind of has this hybrid jazz funk approach, flexible time feel, melodic drumming approach, and cross-genre fluidity. You hear that so much on Live Action. You hear him as a pocket player. You hear him as a modern producer, which is really something interesting. He really takes on some production aesthetics, and someone who is not afraid to step outside jazz. So this is very different from the traditional festival gatekeeper models. This signals a potential shift in Newport, and as a result, in institutional jazz directions. So let's talk about, now that we've looked at the influence of Newport and we've looked at what Nate Smith is bringing to the festival through his career, let's look at how this could go. Now, time will tell. We don't know anything yet. No artists have been announced, nothing yet. But let's think about what we know and where this could go. Now, I'm going to talk about Live Action for a minute, which was Nate's Grammy Award-winning album, again in the alternative jazz category. And this was basically a pop album with jazz tinges, which leaves me with some concerns because this was promoted, this was sold in the jazz category, and it even got that Grammy in a jazz category. Now, granted, it was in that really mushy, weird alternative jazz category, which who even knows what that is, but it was basically a pop album, highly produced, brought in some pop standards alongside some jazz improvisations, and it makes me wonder what Nate Smith's priorities are musically. And when we talk about things like artist-audience connection, when we talk about things like pushing the music forward, are we talking about programming things that we can say are maybe slightly jazz adjacent, but not really in the tradition to bring in audience, to bring in acclaim, to bring in love for the music? I don't know. Now, the good thing to consider is Newport doesn't really need it. It's been a sold out show for many, many years at this point. It's not like they're looking to revive it financially or anything like that. But if this is the artistic direction that the artistic director of the Newport Jazz Festival thinks is important, we might see a majority of programming like that. And I'm going to say I hope not, honestly, because this is sacred ground where innovation should be sitting alongside tradition. And I would argue the point that pop music being sold as jazz is not innovation. I would argue that point any day of the week. Now, let's be fair, Nate Smith is a completely legit drummer that understands traditional jazz deeply. He's played with serious jazz artists. He's played with Dave Holland, Betty Carter, Chris Potter. He hangs with the Cats. So there is that possibility and likelihood that he'll keep a balance right there. So I am keeping that light on right there. And in all fairness, so the last artistic director was Christian McBride, and he certainly experimented with bringing in artists that were jazz adjacent. We had folks like the rapper Andre 3000 perform at the Newport Jazz Festival. So many of these artists that kind of questionable, but the thing is that really made me feel okay about that is that Christian McBride just seemed so much more deeply rooted in the tradition through the projects he's done. It always seemed like there was no doubt that he would keep that link there. And maybe I'm playing favorites. I believe that Nate Smith could do the same thing. I'm just not seeing it from his history right now. And then we're hearing a lot about artist-audience connection. Again, I mentioned that before, But what even is that? Does that mean helping the audience understand what the artist is doing? Making that more apparent to people? That, to me, that's exciting. Okay? Taking music that may be hard to understand, music that may be challenging, and finding ways through social media, through, I could see a series of YouTube videos on different artists, through maybe talks at the festival, maybe visiting schools, maybe going into the community ahead of the festival to bring the audience into the artist's work. That to me is exciting. I would love to see that happen, and I would love to see Nate Smith make that happen. But let's look on the flip side of that. Does that audience-artist connection mean that the artist does things to bring in an artist, which potentially means bending their art to the audience's preferences? Now, this is there's no shame in an artist wanting to have a career, wanting to make some money, and making that conscious decision to change their artistic direction in order to appeal to a wider audience. We've seen it before in jazz, but I'll also point out that that did lead us to smooth jazz, which, say what you want, I'm not a fan, and I would hate to see the Newport Festival start that whole new trend of something along those lines. So we'll see. At the end of the day, I believe in Nate Smith. I love his drumming. I think he has some serious artistic depth, and I think he could do some really great things at Newport. I say that alongside the concerns I've voiced, but I'm open to being wrong. I am open to seeing what happens. I imagine that we will be hearing in the next month or so a lineup. We'll be hearing more about the festival. We'll be hearing more from Nate. So stay tuned. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this appointment? What do you think about what it could mean for Newport? And what do you think, would you like to see programmed at the Newport Jazz Festival, and why? Tell me any and all that down in the comments. It's a really important thing that we need to be thinking about, we need to be talking about. So let me know what you think. Boy, but that is not the end of the festival news. Right alongside this major announcement from Newport, we got the announcement of the first ever Los Angeles Jazz Festival. Now, this is a big deal. LA is a big city. It has been a center for a really cool jazz scene for a long time. This jazz festival is going to be a 25-day citywide jazz festival that's going to happen in August of 2026. This is designed as a large-scale international cultural event. They are expecting somewhere in the vicinity of 250,000 attendees. That is a lot of people listening to jazz. They are going to have performances across all 15 city council districts. This is big. This aims to position LA as a global jazz destination. Now, this is interesting because, like I said, LA has a pretty happening jazz scene. It has tended to lean more towards fusion but there are some amazing traditional jazz players. There are amazing Latin jazz in LA. The whole thing's happening down there, but there has never been the same sort of kind of international acclaim that a city like New York has gotten. This festival is aiming to do that. This is described as the largest Black-owned jazz festival of its kind, which is also super cool to see happening. And they have stated that their goal is to become the world's third largest international jazz festival. All right, I'll take that. The other two, I'm guessing here, maybe Newport, maybe Montreal. I'm not sure, but hey, third is right up there. We'll take the bronze. This is being framed as one of the biggest new jazz initiatives in the U.S. in decades. That's powerful. A city saying that jazz is important. It represents all of these things in our cities. So we are going to take almost a month to emphasize it. That's powerful. And this is not some small city out in the boonies somewhere. This is Los Angeles, a major hub. This is powerful. This is really exciting to see what happens. Let's talk about what this is going to look like, which I think is one of the most exciting parts. This is a kind of a city takeover type of event where the whole city becomes the festival. It's not they block off a park or a, campground or something like that for a weekend. The city becomes the festival that becomes a multi-layered cultural experience, which I think is really cool. So there's going to be several parts to this. The first part is Jazz in the Park. There are going to be 25 free concerts in public parks across the city. Not just one park, all different parks with community-focused programming, and it's going to be spread across neighborhoods. If you're not familiar with Los Angeles, it is a huge, sprawling city that has a variety of neighborhoods with different socioeconomic and racial makeups. And this city is going to spread these out across parks in all of those districts, which provides accessibility, it provides engagement for different communities, and it opens up the audience for jazz. That's powerful in so many different levels. The next part of the festival is what they're calling Jazz After Dark. This is about 150 shows in local venues. They will be hosted primarily in woman-owned venues, venues owned by people of color, and community restaurants. First of all, I love the cultural awareness around this. I love that they're not just taking the big kind of, pricey clubs that you might usually find around a jazz festival. They're really opening this up. It's going to support local businesses. It's going to support a variety of people, and it's going to connect jazz into the community infrastructure so that jazz isn't this thing that happens over there. It's part of the community. That's powerful. And 150 shows? That's a lot of music. The next part of the event is Jazz on the Beach. This is what they're thinking of as their grand finale. This is going to happen during the closing weekend, August 22nd through 23rd. It's going to be held at Dockweiler Beach. They're expecting an audience of around 40,000 per day. Now, this is the part that looks like the traditional festival that we think of. This is the part that looks like the Newport Jazz Festival or the Monterey Jazz Festival, where there is a place where the whole thing happens. There's lots of artists playing in one day, and lots of people gather in that one place. This is kind of their flagship mass audience event that's going to be the topper of the festival. But that's not all. There's still more as part of this festival. There's the Caribbean Street Festival that's going to happen in downtown El Segundo. This is going to have 4 stages themed around Cuba, Brazil, New Orleans, Afro-Caribbean traditions that focuses on jazz's global and diaspora roots. This is powerful. I have lots of thoughts on this. I'm very excited about this piece of the festival. Hang tight, I'm going to talk about it in just a minute. Another part of the festival that sounds really cool is the State of Jazz Conference. This is going to be a 2-day conference in Marina del Rey. This is going to include industry and cultural discussions around jazz, which is really, really important. Of course, the music, the musicians, hearing that top of the line always, but jazz and music is a business, and so getting people together to discuss that is always important. And in addition to all of this, there's going to be cultural and historical programming, coastal heritage tours, visits to historic Black sites like Bruce's Beach and the Inkwell. All of these that frames jazz as social history, not just music. And there's a lot of that history in the Los Angeles area. This is powerful. This is huge. This is something that we're going to have to pay attention for. And it doesn't end there. So it's not just a series of events. This is held together by some core philosophies. The festival is framing jazz as cultural storytelling. The organizers of the festival are emphasizing African diaspora roots, human rights history, community identity, and civic connection. This is jazz framed as America's classical music rooted in African and Caribbean experiences. This is powerful. This is deep. This is not just let's throw a bunch of music up on stage and make a bunch of money. This is about the impact that the music has had on culture over years. That's powerful. Another core philosophy of the festival is community-centered jazz presentations. That's why they're doing this in decentralized locations. They're bringing in neighborhood engagement, grassroots venues, and bringing in cultural tourism around it. This contrasts with traditional festival models. Like I was saying earlier, a lot of the model is you take one big place, you bring in a lot of artists, they play there in that place for one day, a mass audience comes in to that, and that's the festival. That is not what this is. This is all over Los Angeles. This is engaging the whole city. That is powerful. Now, here is a piece to pay attention to as another core philosophy in the festival. Economic and tourism impact upon Los Angeles, with some goals including boosting local businesses, attracting international visitors, and supporting cultural infrastructure. Now, those on their own are not bad. There's nothing bad about the business side of things, but there are some things to think about that I'll hit in a minute right there that I'm not too sure about. Okay, so there's the festival in a nutshell, both what they're doing and what they believe in and how this is being put together. Now, let's talk about who is putting this together, because I think that is an important part of it. The founder and the driving force behind this is Martin Ludlow, a former LA city councilman and event promoter. Now, he's saying he wants to tell the human rights story of jazz. He wants to connect the music to African American history, and he wants to build a major international cultural event. This is all good things, all really noble goals that are admirable, and I'm all in. But I just want to point out that Martin Ludlow is a politician, not a musician. All right. Now, the festival also has institutional support. This festival is backed by the city of Los Angeles and the leadership around the government. Mayor Karen Bass helped with the announcement of the festival and said the city government is all on board. Great. That is super cool because, again, things like this don't happen in a bubble. You need the support of the full city to meet those lofty goals. So again, thank you, Karen Bass, and thank you, City of Los Angeles. I will point out again, those are politicians talking, not musicians. And who's paying for the whole thing? It's always important to follow the money. Well, the sponsor for this is Airbnb. All right. Again, nothing wrong with that. We are all into big money, supporting the arts because somebody has to. But let's think about that a little bit. Part of the goal of this is city tourism and economic development. That would really benefit Airbnb's bottom line. So there is that investment in that. And again, there's nothing wrong with businesses making money, but it makes me a little bit suspicious. Those are the details. Let's talk about this festival and what's the good and the bad and the ugly right here for a minute. Let's start with the things that I'm excited about the festival personally. I think the cultural storytelling element of the festival is amazing. This is something I think in modern jazz festivals that is missing. Too often we get caught up in the business side of things, but centering the music around African diaspora roots, human rights history, community identity, and civic connection, that's some powerful stuff. And to me, that speaks to the heart of the music. So it sounds to me like somebody gets it. It sounds to me like somebody is coming from the right place. And if this can be pulled off in a way that is real and connects modern human beings to this history around the music, that could be a powerful thing that I think we could all be really proud of. This positions the music not just as an opportunity to sit on the grass, drink wine, have a great picnic, and party along with the music like a lot of jazz festivals are, but a way to reflect upon ourselves as people, which again, right in line with the music. These are the sort of messages that we want connected with jazz. So I really like that piece of it. I also really like the idea of the city takeover element. The idea that the city values jazz is important. And the fact that it's coming to a variety of different neighborhoods emphasizes the fact that jazz is for everyone. I'm going to say it. I think a lot of jazz festivals are elitist. They are. They're expensive. They appeal to a certain cultural element. People who can afford to go and spend the hundreds of dollars to be in this festival for one day, that price tag alone limits who can go. This city takeover idea and the fact that the jazz is going to be happening in a variety of parks and clubs and street festivals, all sorts of things, again, is the right message. Jazz is for everyone. Jazz is not just for the people who can afford to pay for it. This is amazing. I also am really excited about the Caribbean Street Festival. The Caribbean connection in jazz is so core to the music and so often overlooked. The classic example is Jelly Roll Morton original New Orleans jazz innovator, great stride pianist, who was often quoted as saying the Spanish tinge, which is what he called the Caribbean element in the music, was a core part of the music. And here it's being recognized. And I also like that it's not looking at the Caribbean piece of the music as monolithic. This is not just a generic Latin piece of the festival. The festival is getting to Caribbean culture from a variety of different angles. There's a stage for music that came from Cuba, from Brazil, from New Orleans, and then from various Afro-Caribbean cultures. They're seeing the big picture right here. We can say words like Latin jazz, but it's all jazz, and it all came up through the Caribbean into New Orleans and then became music that happened in the United States. We need to start recognizing this, and the fact that this festival is doing that, I think, is really exciting. Another piece of this festival that I just love is the State of Jazz Conference. This reminds me of the New York Jazz Congress, which I covered a few weeks ago, a chance to focus on the business around the music, where industry folks, people in promotion, distribution, and production can get together with musicians and how to talk about how to keep this music relevant, how to sell this music, how to get people listening to this music in our wacky and I would say dysfunctional world of streaming media. Those are important conversations to have, and the fact that this festival is making that part of the festival, I think, is really powerful. And, if this festival continues, this could be an important meeting point for the musicians, for the festival. If Jazz Congress happens on the East Coast, this could be a West Coast version of that. And the music business is in such a state of flux right now. This is an ever-changing landscape, and artists need to be having this conversation. They need to have a voice on the business end of the music, and they need to be having those conversations with people in the music. So it's really exciting that this is happening. So much. Overall, I think this could be a really powerful festival, but I have my concerns, and I want to voice those right now, starting with something that relates back to the Newport conversation we had a minute ago. Now, if you look at the history of the Newport Jazz Festival, it started off with pianist and promoter George Wine running the festival, being the artistic director, until decades later, he turned over the reins to Christian McBride, amazing jazz musician, amazing bass player who really did good by the festival for a decade. Now, the festival has been turned over to Nate Smith, who, again, we'll see what happens, but again, an amazing musician. The Los Angeles Jazz Festival has no artistic director at this point, and that really makes me question who is running the artistic side of the festival. And right away, the cynical side starts thinking, is this more about making money and bringing people into Los Angeles than it is about supporting jazz? There's a lot of talk about culture and history, but the rubber meets the road when we see what musicians are on stage. It's a new festival, so there's no precedent to go by. And honestly, it's not completely unusual to not have a lineup at this point. They just announced the festival. But I would think as part of that, they would announce some sort of artistic director, to somebody who's going to guide the vision, somebody who's going to make sure that the music being presented matches those lofty goals right there. I will also say, right along those lines, It is a little concerning that all of this came from politicians and corporate backers. We heard from the people with the money and the power. We did not hear from the people with the art. And those things need to go hand in hand, because when all we see is money and power, we have to question the priorities of those people, and we have to question how that's going to align with the music. Now, I may be making assumptions here, and that's fine, but in my experience, money and power often leads to making more money and getting more power. And a humble music like jazz might not provide that. I'm a little afraid that this might turn into something a bit like the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, where we have headliners like the Eagles and Stevie Nicks, certainly not jazz artists, that play alongside a sprinkling of jazz in the background. Now, I did mention Los Angeles has a fantastic jazz scene, which I hope is spotlighted alongside some national and worldwide jazz artists. But this is also home to the pop music industry, and I'm afraid that could take over. That could be seen as the way to get people into Los Angeles, to get people paying for those Airbnbs, for Airbnb to get their financial investment back. It is really concerning. Like I said, there's no precedent, and it's not unusual at this point for artists to not be announced yet. But this festival needs to prove that they're going to back up what they promise with their goals. So again, I would imagine in the next month or two, we're going to hear more about the musicians playing as part of this festival. So you better bet that I will be following up on this and talking about it. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Am I being too cynical? Am I being too suspicious? Or do you feel like that's on track? Let me know down in the comments. This is an interesting evolution of the festival model, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Boy, some big festival news this week, and I wanted to end things up talking about not live music, but recorded music. Because after looking back at jazz from 2025 and discovering that I missed a number of albums that were sitting on the top of the JazzWeek charts, I've dedicated myself to keeping an eye on them. So I'm going to be reporting out on my findings about once a month on the JazzWeek charts. And honestly, I'm probably going to start doing that in an independent video where we can take a listen to some of those things and maybe kind of look a little bit deeper at the music and why it is hitting the charts. But I'm going to start things off today by looking at what I'm seeing here on the charts. And it's really interesting. After this first look, I'm not only seeing a path to finding new releases that I've been missing, but I'm also noticing some interesting trends about the business side of the music, which is really powerful and something we can learn from these charts. So let's take a look at some of the things that I'm noticing. So again, the JazzWeek charts are based on radio play. These are the albums that are getting the most play on radio, and we can talk about the relevance of that today in a streaming world, but there is a lot of jazz being played on the radio right now. So let's take a look at it. The first thing I noticed is that newer and younger voices in jazz are rising fast on the charts. So we've got people like saxophonist Alexa Tarantino, who made a huge jump, is at number 2 on the charts, the fastest mover. on that chart right there. And certainly not a legacy artist by any means. The Dave Wilson Quartet had a strong debut and movement up the charts, and the latest album, Feeling from Melissa Aldana, was the most added part of the most added album on the charts right there. This is a clear radio trend that shows that DJs on jazz radio are open to current jazz and younger artists. They are open to keeping their ears to the ground and actively embracing new band leaders and recent releases and sharing these with listeners. So jazz radio, sometimes we might think of this as an older, some might say out of date platform, but it's not, because all of these young, great musicians who are putting out albums are getting play here, and it's showing on the JazzWeek charts. Now, here is a big thing that really, really surprised me. I used to, every weekend when I was growing up, I would listen to Casey Kasem count down I want to say it was the top 20 on the pop charts. And these were all big industry labels. This was all the music on, on Warner, Universal, the big record labels right there. But jazz today has a little bit more of a decentralized industry model. And what that means, that there are big labels. We've got labels like Blue Note, Mac Avenue, Concord, Impulse. They are present on the charts, but they are not controlling the charts. There are plenty of albums on the charts from independent labels holding spaces high up on the charts, and even self-released albums are charting. I would even point out that the #1 album on the chart this week, Nat Adderley Jr.'s album, is a self-released album. So it's not just the labels with the big money behind them that are able to push and promote their music a bit more. It's independent and self-releasing artists. And that's powerful, because that means that jazz is operating through multiple power centers, institutions, independent labels, and artists themselves. Now, some of the smaller labels that are represented there, you've got Crisscross, Savant, the Cellar Music Group, Origin, High Note, Patois. So many of these great small labels from around the country that are putting out great music that would just be a pity that if these got overlooked, because again, the landscape is so broad right now that we need these voices to be represented. And speaking of voices being represented, the self-released albums are so important. Like I said, the #1 album last week is self-released, and this matters because in this day and age where recording technology is more accessible than ever, where the ability to put music out into the world is easier than it ever was before, this is how most jazz actually gets recorded. It shows sustainability of the jazz infrastructure, that an artist can do something on their own terms and put it out into the world and find not only the artistic success that may come with that, but also financial success, which is powerful. I think this also harkens back to the way that jazz radio is put together. Jazz radio still relies on DJs picking the music. This is powerful. I, in my teens and 20s and my earlier years, I I didn't like the idea of somebody picking the music for me. I dreamed about things like the streaming services we have today. But there's so many problems in the way that music gets distributed, the way that music gets discovered through algorithms, through all of that. It is refreshing to think of human beings that have taste, picking different music and not being beholden to large power structures. I never thought I'd say this 20 years ago, but hey, let's bring back DJs. Maybe some gatekeepers matter. That's something to consider. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because that is something I never thought I would say. Another trend that I'm noticing on the charts, a balance between legacy and emerging artists. I mentioned a minute ago about how young and maybe lesser known artists are finding places on the charts. Well, that doesn't mean they are displacing legacy artists. Like I mentioned, Nat Adderley Jr. is at number 1. We've got musicians like Kenny Barron and Dave Stryker on the chart. And these are right alongside younger artists right here. This is jazz at its core. This is tradition and innovation sitting side by side. This is what the music is all about. And it's powerful to see that's not just some high and grand artistic value that we hold on to. This is how the music is being presented out in the world. Jazz radio balances tradition and innovation simultaneously, which is powerful stuff. And the last thing I noticed on the JazzWeek charts, which I just thought was super cool, was the large presence of women in the charts right there. For far too long, jazz has been a man's club, and it's so cool to see folks like Alexa Tino, Melissa Aldana, Lisa Hilton, Ledisi, Carmen Bradford, Betty Bryant, all having significant places on the charts. This is a cultural shift that needs to happen. This is a clear representation trend that needs to happen. This is powerful stuff, and I would love to see more of it happening. Really, really interesting stuff happening on the JazzWeek charts. I'm going to be keeping my eye on them, and like I said, I'm probably going to branch this off into a maybe monthly, every 6-week look at the charts, maybe listen to some of those songs in an independent video, talk about this. I'd love to hear what you think about that idea. I'd love to hear what you think about the charts or any of the artists I mentioned. Throw it down in the comments so we can keep that conversation going. Oh, a lot of really thought-provoking stuff in today's episode. We looked at 3 different forces shaping jazz right now. At Newport, we saw the power of artistic leadership and the responsibility that comes with guiding one of the most influential institutions in the music. And we thought about what is going to happen with the change in that leadership. In Los Angeles, we saw civic and corporate investment positioning jazz as culture, history, and economic strategy, which raises questions about whose priorities are ultimately going to shape this festival and this music. And in the JazzWeek charts, we saw the industry from the ground level, a decentralized ecosystem of institutions, independent labels, and self-released artists all competing for space. Together, all those stories, all those ideas bring us back to the question we started with. Who's shaping jazz today and who should be shaping it? If we look at the history of this music, the answer seems clear. And from a completely biased point of view, I have to say that jazz has always moved forward from musicians taking the lead. When the artistic vision comes first, the industry, institutions, and community just exist to support that vision. And that's how I think this should be shaped right there. But that's not always the reality, and today's reality is even more complicated. Festivals, they shape taste. Cities invest for economic impact. Corporate partnership influence priorities. And musicians often find themselves navigating systems that they didn't create. Sometimes it feels less like driving the music and more like just participating in a structure that's already moving around them. The tension between artistic leadership and institutional power isn't new. It's always been a part of the music industry, and in a way, it's always been a part of jazz, but it's becoming more visible and perhaps more consequential, and perhaps something we should be questioning and working to shape as the music moves deeper into the 21st century. The question is whether the structures around jazz serve the music or whether the music is increasingly expected to serve the structures. I really hope it's the first one, but we're going to keep an eye on those questions, and do everything in our power to make sure the music takes the lead. Because the future of jazz is still being written, and we can be part of that story. My name's Chip Boaz. This has been This Week in Jazz. I will see you soon.